Hello, everybody, and welcome to Around the Layout, where model railroaders come to tell their story. My name is Ray Arnott. So glad you could join us for this episode. Today, we're talking to Joe Parker from the South Shore of Massachusetts. Joe, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Ray.
Hey, great to have you on the podcast. Last I saw you, we were at the Hub Show.
That's right.
Where were we? Was it Marlboro?
We were in Marlboro.
It was in Marlboro, Massachusetts. And I'll tell you, that was a great show.
It is a good little show. It's one of the bigger ones for the area. Certainly no Amherst show, but it's one of the bigger ones in the area. And there's a pretty good cross section of the dealers and stuff. So it's a good one to visit.
Absolutely. I was wildly impressed. I think it was my first visit to the Hub show. I've heard about it, and I pulled in and I was like, I had to go to the far parking lot. I was way up the road and had to hike back in. And I think it was a little bit of rain and cold that day, but because the parking lots were all full and a lot of people there. And like you said, a lot of vendors and a lot of folks selling stuff and some good displays, some layouts. And it's kind of hard to go up and be compared against Amherst, but they held their own and had a great show there. Yeah. So it was good seeing you there, a bunch of other people as well, some folks that we have mutual friendships with and we know through some connections. So it was really good to see that and definitely good to talk to you about this podcast, which leads us to where we are today with you on the show. So good to have you here. So Joe, you're mainly known for your channel, The Pixel Depot. And we're going to get into talking about the Pixel Depot a little bit later, but I want to get to know you a little bit better first. Why don't you tell us, right at the beginning, what drew you into the hobby of model railroading?
So from a very, very early age, we're going back to when I was probably 5 or 6 years old. I lived at that time just outside of Cleveland, Ohio, in a city called Willoughby, just off of Lake Erie. And at the end of our street was it's not really a double main line. It was two separate main lines. One was Penn Central, one was Norfolk and Western. And so I would sit in the front yard and watch the trains go by. And at about that same time, I was sharing a room with my older brother. He's about 12 years older than I am. And he had a little 4x8 layout that he had built. It was nothing spectacular, but it was a cool, nice little layout. So those two things kind of got me interested in trains in general. Fast forward a little bit to me, I guess I was about 9 years old. I got a train set for Christmas, and we recycled that old layout that my brother had and set it up and added some new structures and things like that. And as those things tend to do, I did that for a while. That got put away. Brought it back out as a teenager a little bit. We started building another layout. I went to high school, went to college, all those sorts of things. And then it's been my mid-20s, I really started to get interested in it again. And that's when, things really started to pick up in terms of me learning about railroading and history and getting interested in certain railroads and trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And that's when the bug really, really bit.
Do you remember, like in the mid-20s, because you're really kind of, it's a reflection of a lot of people's stories. They have some stuff as kids and then those teenage years hit and then the education and then come out of it. Do you remember what that event was in your mid-20s that really relit the fire?
I think once again, I've got to give my brother credit for this, right? So he had a friend who had a business that was doing custom painting. So my brother had gotten into helping him with custom painting and so on. And so, we got to talking about things and, I re-sought out Model Railroader magazine. And, that's when I started to pick those things out. But I've got to give my brother some credit for this one as well, that getting me back into it in more of an indirect way this time. But certainly I would credit that as being the inciting event.
Excellent. And you said his friend was doing custom painting.
Yeah. They would, paint to order, mostly locomotives, but doing some boxcars and things like that. So he would, whether it was a prototypical railroad or somebody's freelance road, they would place an order for, I want 3 GP38-2s in this livery and so on and so forth. And, they would go gather that up, get the decals, do all the painting, and at the end of the day, come up with or have a model that the customer had requested.
Were you able to kind of learn any bit from him? Were you connected with him enough to kind of absorb some of that?
I did, probably not as much as I would have liked. At that point in time, we were living about 2.5, 3 hours drive away from each other. But we were in contact enough that I was kind of picking things up, and, he's the one that convinced me to get my first airbrush, get the paint booth and everything going. And that's where, not that I'm a great painter or custom detailer or anything like that, but that's where I got my first exposure to those things and got started at least in that part of the hobby.
Sure. So what was your next what was your project that, I guess, when you said in your mid-20s you got back into it, what were some of the things that you started doing then?
So I started, again, the railroads seemed to follow me around or vice versa. Mm-hmm. In my mid-20s, I was living in Charlton, Massachusetts, and I was living across the street from the Conrail main line, right at the top of Charlton Hill, where it goes from two tracks to double track down to single track as it goes into enter Worcester. And so at that point in time, I would go over and you could hear the train coming up the hill, that low, like that great sound that you get from those EMDs. Sure. Coming up the hill. So you'd have plenty of time to kind of run across the street and grab some pictures and so on. And I had been around Penn Central and Conrail my entire life in terms of, being able to see it. As I mentioned, when we were in Willoughby, it was still Penn Central. I had no idea at the time what was going on. I was not even 6 years old when the Conrail merger happened, but started noticing all these different color locomotives showing up and kind of, wondering what the heck was going on, but having no idea. Right. We then moved to Pennsylvania, rural Pennsylvania, but we lived, if anyone's familiar with the Strawberry Ridge power plant that gets a lot of coal, or at least got a lot of coal, we lived within a mile of that. And the rail line, Conrail rail line, went past our house just across a cornfield. So again, lots of trains and so on. And so, like I said, the trains I've followed the trains around, I guess, or, they've always been there. So Conrail, I grew up with Conrail and always recognized it. So, I started thinking about doing a Conrail layout. And then I realized, I don't have the skills that I need in order to do that. So I joined the Worcester Model Railroaders because I was only a few miles away. And so my idea there was to leverage the experience and knowledge of the club members to teach me what I needed to know in terms of how to build a layout and how to properly wire things and lay track and do all those sorts of things. And I was a member of the club for 20 years and made a lot of great friendships there and learned a lot of stuff. And I got to the point where I moved further away from Worcester so that it was less fun to drive to the club every week for those meetings. Right. I realized, I've learned probably what I can learn from the club. I'm not building my own layout at this time because I'm devoting my energies to building things for the club layout. Right. It's probably time for me to branch out on my own and start to build my own thing. So yeah, that kind of brings us up to the almost the future or the present, I should say.
Before we get there, let's talk about the Worcester Model Railroaders.
Sure.
Because I was a member of that club. You obviously were a member of the club for many years. I wasn't there that long, but I was there and kind of went there on that same philosophy. And I landed a great success in doing that. I met some really great people through that club. Why don't you talk about that? Because 20 years back, where were they located when you joined?
So I joined in 1998, and they were located on James Street in Worcester in the basement of an old wire mill that was a lot wetter than it was dry.
Yeah.
I actually remember one day we got a thunderstorm, a really severe thunderstorm while we had a club meeting. And there was a crack next to the door, and there was water shooting out of that crack into the middle of the room, and it was a sight to behold, for sure. But yeah, that's where we were there. We did a lot of work to try and make it drier, but it was a very, very damp location.
Yeah.
From there, we moved to Dudley, Massachusetts, and there we had a nice dry location. But we had to move out of there when ownership of the building changed, and now they're in Webster.
Right.
So they had just moved to Webster when I left the club.
Yeah. So you kind of went through really kind of two moves, because you were there just as they were moving to the Webster location, and that's the one I know. I never got to see it in Dudley. I've seen pictures of it in Dudley. What would you say some of your biggest takeaways? I mean, you talked about learning things from the club. What were some of the big takeaways from the Worcester Club, and maybe some of the folks there that influenced you as you're building now?
I'm going to say the biggest takeaway that I took had nothing to do with modeling, and that was model railroaders are a great bunch of people in general. There's always the exception and the outliers, but I made some lifelong friends there, people that I never would have run into in my normal life, people that were 20, 30 years older than I am, that became close friends. And like I said, we never would have crossed paths in any other world. So that was the biggest thing that came out of that. But, even on the James Street layout, I started to build a section of that layout, which taught me more about structures, I guess, than anything else, because the track was really in place at that point in time. But once we moved to Dudley, it was a clean slate. So I actually took part in designing that layout. So I learned a lot about track planning and layout design from the aspects of trying to figure out what your concept is, and what point A and point B are, and what's in between, and what industries can you fit in, and so on. And I also had a section of the layout there that it was supposed to be Boston, part of Boston, the old Atlantic Ave, where the Union Railroad used to run. Excuse me.
Okay.
And so that helped me with track laying and structure design and all those sorts of things. And so those were a lot of the things that I ended up taking away from that. But we had people that were great at track laying. So as you're doing things, you pick up hints and tips on the best way to do things so that, your track work is rock solid. We had people that were great at wiring, and I am terrible at wiring, as anyone who follows my channel knows. But I learned some tips and tricks there from people to improve my soldering skills and so on. And that really helped me discover what I like about the hobby and what I don't like about the hobby. And so one of the things I discovered is I love switching. The first layout that I designed for would have been my home layout was what I refer to as a round and round layout.
Sure.
And not knowing any better, I thought, this is what you do. And then, with working in two different layouts at the club, I discovered, what? Round and round kind of, after it goes around twice or three times, I'm kind of done. Yeah. I want to move things around, and taking nothing away from the people who love to just, watch the train go around. There's room in this hobby for everyone, regardless of what you like. But for me, sure, it's really about switching. So, that was one of the things that I learned there. And so, those types of things were what the club really helped me figure out along my model railroading journey.
Yeah, clubs are a good place for that. I joined Worcester because I was, kind of lost. I didn't have a whole lot of information. I knew I wanted to be a model railroader. I did the same thing. I set up a 4x8 thinking that's how you do it, right? I didn't know any better. And I joined the Worcester Club, and I kind of our takeaways kind of are very similar. Met some really great guys, and I know some of the mutual friends, like Tom Tellier is one of your mutual friends, and you talk about a wiring guy. You've picked up a wiring guy.
I have, yeah.
with Tom.
And nobody else can have him. He's mine.
No, there you go. Yeah. Well, I was going to ask you, I wrote down a note here. You had Tom in one of your videos. I was wondering how much powder you had to put on his forehead to keep the light from blinking off the top of his head. But he's really a great guy. He was one that I enjoyed spending time with when I was in the Worcester Club. And then, the Worcester Club's got a couple other great guys in it with Dick Irish was, a member there. And I learned quite a bit from Dick and spent some time with him, watching him do scenery. And then, of course, I met my friend, the late Mike Du Bois, there at the club, and he became my mentor. So again, what my point being, if anybody's out there and you're trying to find a place to start and you just want to connect, a club is not a bad place to go if you don't have a layout. But one of the downturns, as you did say, is you get to the club and then you're putting all the effort into the club, and then if you want to do your own layout, it kind of suffers a little bit. Were you able to do anything on your layout? Were you kind of starting something while you were in the club, or kind of a little overlap there?
So when I lived closer to Worcester, I did start a layout in my basement, and that got to a certain level, but that was also during the period of time where I was figuring out what I liked and didn't like. So that layout, as I mentioned, was designed as around the walls, but mostly designed around through trains. And once I figured out, switching is really what I want to do, that entire layout didn't make sense anymore. So I tried to rework the design to fit the switching mold that I wanted to go in, and spent a couple of years trying to do that. And it didn't work. It was not set up for that. But I got the bench work up. I got a yard in. I got an area that was supposed to be a paper mill in there, and got that up and running. But it never got beyond the plywood stage in terms of completion. So there was definitely lots more that could have happened there. But yes, I was making progress on that. And then once I moved away, I was in the process of preparing to finish the basement. And I knew that was going to take a while because we had a couple of cracks in the foundation that we had to worry about water coming in and things like that. So in the meantime, I built a long, narrow layout that I actually had on wheels so I could move it around the basement, thinking that as I tried to finish the basement, I could move the layout around. That plan didn't work out so well, but it was a good idea in theory. But I did get to the point of getting the track down, got the wiring done. I could run trains on it. I had a couple of small structures started on that, but then I realized that in order to get the basement finished, I was going to have to dismantle that. And so I did that, went through the process of finishing the basement, and as the basement was getting finished was right about the time that I moved on from the club.
Okay. Yeah. So you kind of had your canvas ready to be painted.
I did. Yeah.
So, yeah. So talk about that. So you get this nice, you finish your basement. What's in your mind? What are kind of the things that you want to accomplish down there? Did you have a track plan kind of drawn as this was happening? Did you have these kind of plans ready to go?
I did have a track plan drawn, and it's still in its latest draft. It's probably pretty close to finish now, but let me back up a step and talk about sort of a little bit more of the path. Sure. When I was that round and round layout that I was building was actually a freelance railroad. I had, as I mentioned, I had for a while lived across the road from Conrail. For whatever reason, at that time, I thought that doing a freelance road would be cooler than actually modeling Conrail. And maybe that had to do with my brother doing the custom painting and so on. I kind of got attached to the idea of a freelance road, but it was based on Conrail at the end of the day. And so it was called the Wachusett and Erie, and I came up with a livery for it and all those sorts of things. And then somewhere along the line, and I couldn't tell you exactly when it happened, I remembered going back again to my childhood days. That was in the mid 70s to late 70s. And every manufacturer under the sun had stuff painted for the chassis system, just because, it was such a bright, colorful livery. It was something that I guess represented the future, and everybody kind of took to it, and so there was all this stuff that was painted for it, whether they had that equipment or not. They never had F units, but there's definitely chassis system painted F units running around.
Right.
It's how it is.
Yeah, every kit, like every Bachmann kit, everybody had a chassis system. Yeah,
exactly.
No. Yep.
Because it was bright and colorful, and that's what that's what attracts kids, right? So
exactly.
It makes perfect sense.
And it has a cat on it, so yeah, go for it.
It does. So I forget what kind of made me think of that. I was like, I really used to like that livery, and so I started to do some research, and the more I looked into what the chassis system really was and how it was put together and the areas that it operated in, it really started to get into my psyche. And so I gave up the Wachusett and Erie and started looking at building a chassis system layout. And when I was doing my research and trying to figure out things that were going on, I definitely leaned more towards the B&O aspects of the chassis than the C&O. And so at some point I was doing research and found that they had an area in Baltimore where there was street running, and I had bought a video from Pentrex called Street Running, and that really captured my imagination as well. That the thought of these huge trains running through city streets was just something that I thought was pretty cool. So I started to do some research to find areas where that actually took place, and it turned out that there's a street in Baltimore called Wicomico Street that had a branch that kind of went right down the middle of the street. And I'm like, okay, this is great. So I'll focus my attention on Baltimore. So that solved a bunch of problems in terms of trying to figure out what to model, what area to model, and so on. It was all switching. So, I didn't have to worry about how to build that into it, because for those that don't know, the chassis system, which has since become CSX, those railroads built themselves on coal. So, a lot of modelers that model chassis do the mountainous Allegheny areas and so on. As we've covered, that doesn't really interest me very much. So finding a place where I could do the switching aspects of it was really pretty cool. And then as I did more research on Baltimore, there's so much going on in Baltimore in the 70s and 80s. There were, I'm not joking, there were 8 different classification yards around the city. There was tracks running all over the place. And so it really became a challenge to narrow it down to what I could fit into a layout.
Right.
And where I landed was with the Sparrows Point subdivision, which is on the east side of the city. It comes off of Bayview Yard. So there was a Chessie Bayview Yard and a Conrail Bayview Yard that are right next to each other. Now it's CSX and Norfolk Southern. Those still exist. And the subdivision came off of that. And its primary purpose was to serve the General Motors assembly plant that was down there. I always liked the idea of doing something with the auto industry. So that worked with what my interests were. It was nice and short, so I could model it pretty faithfully. And there was a truss bridge down there that was one of only like 3 that had ever been built in that style. There was a lot of really interesting things down there. So all of that kind of combined to make me give up the Wachusett and Erie concept and go full throttle on chassis. The other nice thing about that, and I mentioned that the Conrail yard is right there. Well, Conrail was in that area too. And having grown up with Conrail, and I still to this day don't know why I just never decided to model Conrail, but it was a nice 1-2 punch to be able to build those. So, I've got tracks that kind of run side by side. They're at different heights and so on. So it gives you some visual interest, and it was just a nice package for me that I went to that. So when we moved to this new house, I knew ahead of time what the basement looked like. I started doing the plan. I found that I could work in the auto assembly plant. I could work in the loading area for the auto loading area that was right next to that, and a little yard. I could work in the coal, consolidated coal loop that was in there that both Conrail and Chessie used to export coal. And I was really able to nail down that southern portion of the layout. The northern portion nearer the yards has been a little trickier, but I think I finally nailed that one down in the last iteration that I've done. I'm pretty happy with. So, but it does also using a little bit of license, even though Wicomico Street is on the west side of the harbor. I've thrown a Wicomico Street section in there as well. So I'll be rebuilding that portable layout that I had there, or at least using the track plan for it. So that's kind of the way things have rolled out there.
Now, you just told us a whole bunch about the Baltimore area and the Chessie system and how the Baltimore and Ohio became your choice. But I'm looking here, you've lived in Ohio, you've lived in Massachusetts and a couple different places, but it doesn't look like you've ever lived in Baltimore. So you learned a lot. Talk about your research into this, because this is an important part of anybody that's trying to design or decide what they want to do. And it sounds like you've done some extensive research. Talk about how you've gathered all this information.
Yeah, research is the thing, because oddly enough, I never saw a Chessie system locomotive run in real life, at least not at a museum. So everything I've learned has come down to research. So we talked about the benefit of clubs. Now I'm going to tout the benefit of historical societies. So I joined the Chessie System Historical Society and the Baltimore and Ohio Historical Society, and they have been a huge wealth of knowledge for kind of tracking these things down. The track plan that I have now is thanks to what the Baltimore and Ohio Historical Society sells, these street maps that are just pages and pages and pages of different areas. In my case, Baltimore, but they have other ones that cover different sections of the railroad that were immensely useful. I've got a shelf full of Chessie System and Baltimore and Ohio books that I use as reference. I've taken a number of trips down there and kind of stomped around to see what those areas look like and get a feel for how the tracks were laid out and so on. So I'm kind of a research geek anyway. I like to just go to Google Maps and sort of zoom in and try and figure out where the railroads used to run, and based on where the trees are and rights of way and stupid stuff like that.
Yeah, ghost railroading, right?
Exactly. Yeah. But yeah, I've spent probably more hours than I probably want to count up doing research and trying to find information. But that's part of the hobby that interests me as well. So I've always kind of subscribed to the Alan McClelland good enough theory, but I guess everybody's idea of good enough is a little different. So I've made some decisions about my layout that are good enough for me, but go way beyond what anybody else would know or even care about. So the guys that help me out building the layout, they don't know much or if anything about the Chessie system. So I start to tell them about why I made this decision, and they're like, "You're the only one that's ever going to know that. Why do you even care?" I'm like, "Because I'll know."
Right.
So,
and when you're building a layout for yourself, which you talk about in some of your videos on the Pixel Depot, building a layout for yourself kind of things, that you still know, and what would you say was your most painful cut in all of this to try to cut it down? Like, what was the one that you had to cut but was like the biggest hurt kind of feeling?
Yeah, that's I managed to get a bunch of it back in this most recent sort of edit that I did. The first trip even before the first trip that we made down there, I had sort of honed in on this area called Halethorpe, which is even further west than Wicomico Street. And it was this big industrial park that the the main line, was up on the hill, and it kind of came down the hill, and there was a whole ton of stuff in there. There was a brewery in there. There was a whole bunch of warehouses. There was an old A&P distribution center that had, a building for produce, a building for grocery, and a building for frozen foods. Had a little yard in there, and it was really a neat area. And I had plans of trying to fit a lot of that stuff in, and it just never ever worked out. So I had to basically cut that entire concept out of my track planning, and moving it to the Sparrows Point, which is all the way on the other side of the city, made that a little easier to do. But I never quite got over it. So the latest iteration has I'm playing with history, because in my plan, this area is served by Conrail, but the A&P warehouse is back. There's a small version of the brewery, which the brewery in Halethorpe was actually a Carling brewery, but anyone that's been to Baltimore or knows anything about Baltimore knows that the National Bohemian, or Natty Bo, was a big thing there. So I've made my brewery a Natty Bo brewery. Yep. So I did manage to get some of that stuff back, but I'm preaching to the crowd here with the people that are listening and yourself, but model railroading is nothing except an exercise in compromise. So, yeah, right. You're always trying to figure out what fits and what you can selectively compress, and what has to come out and what can stay in, and so on. So, it's without going to a double deck, which again, I learned is not one of the things that I enjoy working on over the years. This is what I ended up with, and the limitations, and it works for me. I think it's a layout plan that is achievable in my lifetime. I think it's got a lot of interest in terms of different switching areas and different industry types, so I can have a lot of different car types and so on. I've made some decisions on that which help to limit what I actually purchase, and I actually stole this idea from my friend Greg, who I also mentioned in a bunch of my videos. But his planned layout is 4-axle power only, and Chessie was the biggest purchaser of GP40-2s. And so, they were big on 4-axle power, which kind of helps. They had some SD40-2s and eventually SD50s, but they had just a huge fleet of GP40-2s, 40s, and 38s. So I kind of went along with that, only having 4-axle power, which limits what I have to look at when all these really cool new models come out.
It's a governor, right? It governs, what comes out of your wallet to buy. That's probably exactly a wise move. I think the last blog post I put up on my blog was about SD40-2s and how SD40-2s are actually my favorite locomotive ever. And Chessie only had a small fleet of them, and Athearn was coming out with something in their Genesis line that looked beautiful. But it was like, no, it doesn't fit. So, it pains me to not get one, but I'm not getting one. Right. And it keeps you focused on what you're doing there too, because boy, especially nowadays, the manufacturers, they're rolling out releases almost weekly, it seems, just on this crazy pace. So you really got to stay disciplined and know what you're really doing, stay on a plan. And, if you want to accomplish a completion, and certainly don't want to blow your budget all on locomotives, that's a good way to do it. Make it a 4-axle restriction, or just know that this is what we're going to do, and we're going to follow the prototype. And
we spoke earlier. My layout is set between July 11th and July 17th of 1984 for a number of different reasons, but that is also extremely helpful in focusing your attention, because it's a very specific week in a very specific year. I know what kind of equipment I need in terms of rolling stock, and anything that's too late, I shy away from. There are a couple of exceptions that I've made, and a couple of frustrating discoveries that I've made after I've purchased things. But in general, it really does help to keep the budget in line.
Well, is there anything significant to that week of July 11th to 17th?
So this again goes back to sort of the planning process, and less about the planning than it is about what Lance Mindheim would call layout design. I was a teenager in the early 80s, and I just remember summers being hot and humid. And we didn't have a ton of money, so we didn't have air conditioning, and summers were just hot and humid. And so I kind of wanted to emulate that, or kind of bring out that atmosphere. And so I kind of went looking, again, more research, and found that week in July was the hottest and humidest of that particular summer. And I picked 1984 because Chessie System, to celebrate the 50th anniversary of GM doing the electromotive division, one of their GP40-2s was actually gold and was numbered GM50. Yep. And that unlike other railroads, the GM50 was just in general service. You could find that on coal drags. You could find it in switching service. It was all over the plant. Well, they repainted it into Chessie, typical Chessie colors sometime in August of that year, if I'm not mistaken. So that kind of time bound me there. And there was something that is not coming to mind right now that time bound me on the other end as well. So it really narrowed it down to that sort of 1983, 84 era, and all these other things that I've been talking about really helped to hone it in on that specific time period. And then the whole weather thing, it was hot, it was humid, there was no rain. And so that was kind of went along with the whole sort of stickiness that I was trying to bring into the equation. So that just worked for me.
Yeah, I was going to say, because it's very specific. You talk about... It is
very specific. Yeah.
I mean, I've heard people say, okay, this is based in, July of 84 per se, or, that idea. Or, I've got it in the autumn of any year in modern or whatever, 2016, they do a cutoff. But I've never had anybody plug it down, at least that I've heard, to plug it down to an exact week. So does all your paperwork, do you do any paperwork, does it all say like one of those dates on it and just kind of like frozen in time in that week?
Yeah, I'm still in the early stages of developing all my paperwork, but choosing a week was definitely part of that as well. So that when we had operating sessions, it wasn't always going to be the exact same trains. There would be trains that ran on Monday that didn't run on Tuesday, and trains that were idle on the weekends because the plant wasn't running or something like that. So I figured choosing a week would give me some flexibility and some variety when it came to different operating sessions, so that it didn't get too routine and too monotonous. Yeah.
So let's talk about operating. Have you been doing any operating sessions on the Monument City Terminal division?
We have, as I mentioned, the plant is up and running. There's an auto rack yard that's there. There's another yard that's meant to represent Penn Mary Yard, which was the yard that was right next to the auto plant. And there's a small Canton Railroad interchange there. It's only 2 tracks, but it represents the ability to kind of move those things over, as well as the coal plant. And I've got another industry that I chose in Baltimore was Cambridge Iron and Metal. And that comes from basically the first trip I ever made down there. There was, it caught my attention and I kind of latched onto it. So I built a temporary staging yard, because I'll veer off a little bit to say my philosophy is not to build the whole layout, because I wanted to be able to build a section, get it up and running, actually be able to play with the trains, and not have it be, all right, I'm doing bench work for 2 years, and then I'm doing track work for 2 years, and it's 10 years before you actually get to run a train. I didn't want to do that, so I put in a temporary staging yard, and we've probably had somewhere between 6 and 10 operating sessions. I have a modeling group that we meet once a month, and we generally tend to try and operate once a quarter.
Okay. Yeah, let's talk about that too, because you just recently did a video on the Pixel Depot, which we haven't gotten to yet, but in there you talk about your monthly modeling sessions, and you've received some help. You mentioned earlier, and you say in your videos you talk about wiring, and that's where Tom Tellier and others come in. Talk about that, and kind of that philosophy of having others helping you with the layout.
Yeah, it really comes down to this sort of thought that, we can't all be great at everything, right? And so even back on that first layout that I did, the Wachusett and Erie, I approached a bunch of guys from the Worcester Club that I was particularly close with and said, "Hey, I'm starting to build my layout. Would you be interested in coming down and helping me, once a month or whatever?" And we tried to do it as a round robin thing for a while, and that worked for a little while, but it kind of fell apart there. But again, it was that idea of lots of hands make things go quicker. You can leverage that experience that other people have. One of the great things that comes out about it is, I have a vision for how this thing is supposed to look and work and so on, but it's, I'm no expert on everything. So it's great to actually get other people in the room and have them say, well, you said you wanted to do it this way, but have you thought about doing this? And a lot of times those thises are brilliant ideas that, I probably should have come up with, but didn't. And, it raises the level of quality and the whole concept of the layout. So, that was the sort of genesis of that for me. And then fast forward to a few years ago, I went to an NMRA event somewhere near Boston, and Stephen Priest, who was formerly the editor of Railroad Model Craftsman, was the featured speaker. And he was building this massive layout in his house in St. Louis or near St. Louis. It's a double deck thing that was probably, 3,000 square feet, times two, because it was double decked. And so he had gotten a group of people together. And apparently that area is just a hotbed for model railroaders anyway. So there's a lot of people he could call in. But he got this group together to help him build the layout. And I thought that was great. But again, for him, it was more about, I've got this massive thing that I'm never going to be able to finish myself. For me, it's more about the sharing of the skills, sharing of the camaraderie and, getting all those things together and so on. That really brought me to do it. And, I came away from that session with a renewed interest in the group. And he had also talked about a bunch of different things that he did that I thought were pretty creative. So I stole from him liberally in my concept.
Permanently borrowed. That's a nicer way to say it,
yes,
right? You permanently borrowed all those things. And you hit it. I would talk about this in many podcasts about, the beauty of sharing this hobby. And, if you're one that wants to do everything on your layout and you've got the skills, that's great. But if you can bring in somebody and share, and like you said, some of the times they just come in, they help you remove the blinders. Like, I'm get in an area and I want to accomplish this, and you've gone over it 100 times, and that one guy will walk in and say, just move that there. And you're like, oh, there it is. There it is. It's so much fun to share the hobby being shared, whether we're doing it on video or on podcasts or in person, having people over your house doing work sessions or whichever way, or joining a club. It really is a great social hobby, and it's really good to extend yourself out enough to be able to connect with those types of people.
It really is. Yeah.
So one way you've really connected, and we'll get to this because we talked a bit about your layout, and I'm sure there's a ton more we could talk about. We got a lot here. So I do want to talk about the Pixel Depot, which is your YouTube channel where you're sharing out a whole bunch of information. You've got videos on weathering, scenery techniques, but the real big takeaway I got from the Pixel Depot is you're not appearance wise and kind of, but like the Matt Foley motivational speaker of model railroading, right? You're going right at people, and I like your approach because you got a great humor about the videos, but you're direct, and you're really trying to get the people going to build those. So talk about how you've kind of developed this Pixel Depot project and sharing these videos out. What spawned that project?
The initial thought on it was, model railroading is a great hobby, and I wanted to share it with people. And I know a lot of people that want to be model railroaders, and they buy the stuff and, get all this, everything together, but they never they never actually get around to building a layout, and whether that's fear or lack of motivation or whatever it is. I wanted the people to understand that, yep, it's a complicated hobby, but if you go in small steps, you're going to learn things. You're going to build your skill set. You can do this. Don't be an armchair modeler forever. And another piece of that was being a member of the Worcester Club. We had a number of members during my tenure there that passed away, and you'd get that call from the widow saying, there's a basement full of stuff here that I have no idea what to do with. And can you help me? So we'd go over and we'd catalog all this stuff. And more than once, it was a basement full of stuff that, went back 20, 30, 40 years that were still in shrink wrap, that were still sealed and never had a layout been built. Yeah. And I think that's really a shame because, part of the fun of model railroading, certainly the operations aspect of it is fun, but that's the end product. But the construction process is really fun too. And there's a lot to learn and a lot of great aha moments that come along from that. So I really wanted to kind of push people and say, don't just be a collector. If you want to be a collector, that's fine. But don't, in my opinion, don't call yourself a model railroader. You're a collector. Yeah. If you want to be a model railroader, you need to build something.
Right.
And
it's a lot of the people. Yeah, I'm sorry. It's a lot of the people that are like, I steal from Dave Ramsey. They call it, he would say, ready, aim, 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 yep. Pull the trigger. And it seems like there are guys there, but there is a legitimate fear about pulling that trigger. And, and like you said, some may be collectors, but I'm willing to bet a lot more of those people that just kept aiming, but didn't know how to pull the trigger.
Yeah, and I'm not immune to this either. There are plenty of things that are sitting on my workbench that, I should do. There's no reason I'm not doing it other than I've never done it before. I'm kind of afraid of it, but I kind of have to stay in my head and say, this is what you're preaching, practice what you preach. Yeah. So, and another way, another video that I did recently was, it was about the modeling groups, but there was a secondary piece of it, which was mastermind groups. And this is something that I've participated in more for a personal development thing. But what it really is not so much the hands-on help me construct a layout, but the mental aspects of it. Let's get a bunch of like-minded individuals into a room. We're all going to be our support system for each other. Let's talk about what you plan to do and why you want to do it, and let's brainstorm how you can achieve those things and set goals every month that you can work towards. Let's meet that on a regular basis. So I did that and launched an initial program that I've had a couple of people sign on for to actually lead these mastermind groups. And so, that's something that's available to people. Not that I want to go all sales mode or anything like that, but if people are not getting the goals that they want to, this might be something to check out.
Oh, it's definitely helpful to have that, the encouragement and somebody guiding you along. And, I talked about, I had a mentor, and, I've got a great group of guys that I model around and we operate around. And, it's definitely great when you have a group kind of just encouraging you. And as they see changes to your layout, they notice them, or you're talking about changes to your layout and you can talk it out with them. And if you don't have that, it's great to have those resources, the council, right? The council of people that can really help you out.
Yeah. So, that was what really got me started on the groups are kind of a thing that have come about more recently, but just let's talk about this and show you that it's not as hard as you think it is. That was kind of what got me started. And then when I really went full bore on starting the channel, which was early spring of 2021. That's when you start paying attention to what other people are doing on YouTube. And so, I had no idea what I was doing. I set up a camera and started talking on a microphone that was across the room, and there was echo all over the place. And it was horrible. Some of those early videos just make me really cringe. But one of the things that I noticed is most of the YouTubers that have, a following they've got something in the background. So what I came up with as a background was, well, I can build a layout and I can show people, all the different steps of building a small shelf layout. So I came up with a plan that was 15 inches by 90 inches long. I did negotiate additional basement space with my wife beforehand so that I can stay married. And she was cool with it as long as it stayed along that one wall. And that's really helped to sort of, give a focus to the process so that we started at the beginning with talking about how to plan a layout and do the track plan. And then, as the episodes progressed, we put together bench work, we laid the track, we did the wiring, we did a backdrop, I did a backdrop image, started building structures and talked about kit bashing and all those different things. And I actually need to get back to it. It's been a number of months since I've done a grunge video, but I need to do some more kit bashing and some planning of the structures on the end and so on. But again, it was really all about showing people, you can do this. You don't need a ton of space to do this.
Yes.
And because you can start small, you don't necessarily need a ton of money to do this. Although I know that, sometimes money issues are very, very real for a lot of people. So I don't try to push that too much, but I do try to push on the excuses of I don't have any time and I don't have any space.
Yeah, and we talked in other podcasts. I've talked in personal conversations, and one thing that's amazing about our hobby is the multitude of entry points. Whether you want to build a big layout, a medium-sized layout, or now this whole thing with the shelf layout and the one, I've heard one turnout layout terms, and there's a bunch of different ways to just simply get into this hobby, and you don't have to build a massive empire to be considered a model railroader. You can build something like this, like you said, 15 by 90. That's a switching layout. That's actually a pretty sizable, with length switching layout, but nonetheless, it's not overly complicated, and likely you can find the room. And if you can't find the room, you could cut that in half and still have a decent switching layout.
Yeah.
So
it literally sits on top of two, they're sort of bookcases. They're more, I think I got them at Target. They're sort of those setups where there's like nine different cubes that you can get the sliders in, and it just sits on those. So it's 36 inches. That sits 36 inches across above the floor. The bench work is 4 inches or something like that. I use Gator foam for it, so it's 40 inches off the floor. You can operate from a chair to get eye level, but it tucks into between a door that goes into a storage area in our basement and the wall that runs along the stairway. So, that was kind of where my criteria and my area that I had to work with, and I fit it in there. So, but and I've done at least a couple operating session videos on that layout. You can spend 30 to 60 minutes operating that layout, moving, 7 or 8 cars. So,
my good friend Joe Mammy would tell you that, those instant on layouts where you can go down, even if you've got 15 minutes just to go down, if you're having a stressful day and things aren't going your way or whatever the case is, and you just need something to get your mind off of things, go down there, just flip it on and move a couple cars. Just to run it. And if you got 15, 20, 25 minutes, and like you said, in a 30-minute operating session, you can wiggle that out in a day. It just gives you that, and you don't mess anything up. Then you just go back the next day and switch some more cars.
Right. So, and if you had a really stressful day, it's the flipping off part that's going to be really satisfying. Right?
Yeah, there you go. Right. Yeah, exactly. So, it gives you all that, and it's a great. And then you've created a concept there that you can share out in your videos. It amazes me in this short period of time. You've got 5,500 subscribers. You got over 60 videos in there. And on a great, like I said, great mix of things, the techniques and motivation, philosophy, that you just cover a whole bunch of bases. I got to ask you this though, when you've obviously designed a layout to kind of work with the videos. I know for me with the podcast, like my little switching layout down in the basement kind of suffers for the podcast. How do you get that balance, of doing the videos, and how does that really, what kind of impact does that have on your modeling, both positive and negative?
Well, that's sort of the beauty of it, right? So I'm showing people how to build stuff, so I'm building stuff. While, the modeling aspect for the main layout may have suffered some, I definitely have not been idle, for sure.
Right.
Putting that layout together. So I have been trying to figure out ways to sort of bring some of the focus back to the main layout so that I can make that progress. One of the things that I cut out of the final edit of my last video was basically saying, it was the one on the modeling groups, because it used to be a lot easier to just mark down the tasks and have people pick whatever they wanted to do. And now it's like, well, maybe I'll hold that one back because that would make a good video. So there's less things that are up for grabs because you want to make a video out of it. Because you're, as you know, with the podcast, you're always on the search for more content.
Sure.
YouTube is a beast. It's a bottomless pit of need for new content. So you're always looking for those things.
Was this your first forte into doing video, or have you done stuff before?
I've done a little bit of video. One for my job back in the early 2000s. I helped put together a demo video for the company that I was working for, and I've done a couple of little different things, but nothing to the extent of what I've learned over the last 2 years in terms of production values and good lighting, which I still struggle with, but good lighting, good sound, editing, mastering all the different cool things that you can do with the editing software and scripting and all those sorts of things. So I had I'd call it a tepid foundation in it, but it's really something that I've learned a lot about in a short amount of time. So,
yeah, it's a challenge, I admire you because here is just audio. I mean, you and I can see each other right now as we're recording this, but it's just audio. I don't have to worry about lighting and video as long as you can kind of see me and on light. That's fine. But you got a lot of elements to balance there, and it only becomes its own hobby within the hobby.
A little bit, yeah. Especially when you're trying to, I don't have a sound stage by any stretch, so I'm doing this in, what's basically a small. The grunge is in a small room that has like a freezer in it, some bookcases and things like that. And then trying to do some of this on the basement side. You're trying to fit the lights in around walls and the layout and, all these different impediments. And anyone that's watched the videos knows that I wear glasses. So, you got to worry about the light bouncing off your glasses and, what angles. And yeah, it's a little bit crazy and it can be a hobby unto itself. But worse than that, I think, is the editing. Like the editing, for anyone that wants to do a YouTube channel, expect to spend probably 60 to 70% of your time editing. Doing the raw footage is easy, and even that can be frustrating sometimes. But I can nail the raw footage for a 30-minute video in 60 to 90 minutes. But editing that 30-minute video may take me 2 full business days to run through. There are people out there that just have no cuts and just throw whatever comes in camera in there. I'm a bit more OCD than that and wanted to have higher production values. So I do spend a reasonable amount of time doing editing to make it look professional. And I think that the 5,500 subscribers that you mentioned is, you can certainly relate some of that to the production values. Because when I first started, there were a number of channels that I looked at that, at the time seemed like they had a ton of subscribers, that now 2 years later, I've got more subscribers than they do. And some of that comes down to what the content's like and, how they market themselves. But a lot of it, I think, has to do with production value as well.
Yeah, you definitely want it, and you put out good quality product. And like I said, your videos are a great mix of information and a little bit of humor and, relatability. And I think that's very important when you're putting this stuff together, whether it be the podcast or a video or whatnot, just something that, we can all relate to. And that's what I hope people get out of around the layout. And I hope that, and I'm sure that's the same thing with you. They just something, hey, that makes sense to me. I can relate to how that's doing. And, that's where you drum up more interest, and that's all. That's what it's about: reaching out and getting that information out to as many people as possible.
I agree 100%.
Well, we're going to wrap this up on this episode of Around the Lab. Before we do that, I'm going to ask what's the next big thing for the Monument City Terminal Division?
So the next big thing is the expansion. So I'm going to be taking out that temporary staging yard and kind of finishing the horseshoe that's going to go around the walls and build a new yard at the end of that. And then there'll be a peninsula that comes out from the middle of the layout. As I mentioned, I just finished the plan for that, and there'll be a video coming up on that pretty soon. And I really need to post the track plan on my blog as well. But that's the next thing. I've been waiting fruitlessly for lumber prices to come down, and that doesn't look like it's going to happen. So I just have to bite the bullet.
Well, I think you've waited at least. It's not nearly as bad now as it was before. So maybe, yeah,
true.
It's so hard to pin that all down and whatnot. Sometimes, like you said, you just got to bite the bullet and, hope you catch it at a low point. So I want to share before we go, the Pixel Depot on YouTube. We'll share all these links, by the way, in our show notes. So anybody wants to get there, plus on our Facebook page as the episode airs. So the Pixel Depot on YouTube, and then check out Joe's blog and a very resourceful website at Chessie MCTD. That stands for Monument City Terminal Division. So ChessieMCTD.com. And again, the link will be in the show notes. Great resources. You share a lot of information out. You're definitely getting, you provided a lot of great resources to modelers, inspiration and information, and it's really appreciated. And it was great talking to you and learning more about you. And we'll get you back on because there's a lot more to cover. I'm sure we could touch on a lot more on that Monument City Terminal Division. Yep. And then as you make more progress, we'll definitely have you on and we'll chat about that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the kind words. I really do want to help modelers, get past their fears and actually end up doing something. So the fact that people like it and find it resourceful, it really makes me feel good.
Oh, great. And that's awesome. Great to give back to the hobby. So thanks again, Joe, for being on the show.
Anytime. Appreciate it, Ray.